As the top website providers for special purpose districts in Texas, we take great pride in providing outstanding customer service at an affordable price. We offer a wide range of services, including website design, development and maintenance, email and text message alerts, video and teleconferencing services, social media marketing, election education programs, communication consulting, and much more. Together, we can keep your residents informed about your district. Contact us today and see what we can do for you.
Good evening. Welcome to this webcast presented by the State Association of Fire and Emergency Districts, or SAFE-D. We do want to take a moment to thank Infinity Services for their generous sponsorship of this webcast. So thank you very much to them. I'm Clay Avery, your host for tonight. Tonight's webcast does qualify for 1 hour of state-required ESD commissioner training. The webinar is certified by our educational sponsor, the V.G. Young Institute of County Government, part of the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. At the end of the program is when you'll be given instructions on how to apply for your 1 hour of training credit. So hang with us all the way to the end. This webcast is a little different than some of our other webcasts. More than most webcasts, we'll be giving you the opportunity to ask questions. We do that every time, but this one is going to be a lot of your questions. That's what we mean by Ask Me Anything. So here's how you get your questions into us. You can call in, text in, or email in your questions at any time during tonight's broadcast. Feel free to start firing away right now. Here's how you do that. You can call us at 512-251-8101. You can even fax your questions in if you have a fax machine handy, 512-251-8152. Email us. That's the regular SAFE-D email, SAFED at texas.net. Texas is spelled out. Or you can text us your questions at 512-567-0857. Normal text messaging rates may apply there, but that's one way to get your text questions in. We will also try to monitor the chat going on underneath the video, but that's a little less reliable. We urge you to contact us directly using one of the methods I just described. So tonight's webcast is an opportunity to ask questions of one of the foremost attorneys involved with Texas emergency services districts. Since SAFE-D was founded 20 years ago, can y'all believe it? It's been 20 years. We're 20 this year. Ken Campbell has been a true friend for that entire time. Ken's an attorney here in Austin with Burns, Anderson, Jury, and Brenner, but he's also a volunteer firefighter and an ESD commissioner in Travis County. Ken has volunteered to step into the middle of the ring, take on all comers in terms of legal questions about ESDs. We will try to make this as no holds barred as possible. Ask us anything. That's what we said. But we do want to remind you that we're not offering specific legal advice about your particular ESD. You should always seek consult with your own counsel, your own legal advice from your district's attorney before taking any legal opinions you should not take any legal opinions from this webcast. So I've got that disclaimer out of the way. Ken can give his own disclaimer if he wants, but welcome, Ken. How you doing tonight in your office?
Thank you. I'm very well. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. And we hope that the people out there can hear us. Lisa, well, apparently there's an audio issue. But Lisa, text me if you can hear me. Lisa in our office. Somebody just emailed in that there's no audio, but we'll figure out if that's an individual problem or if that's a universal problem. Let's go ahead and get on with tonight's questions. And again, I urge you all to get those into us as you have them. A question on donations. Can the public make donations to an ESD? If so, is there a dollar limit on value? Like, can they donate real property, which would obviously be more expensive? Is there some sort of dollar limit that they need to have to receive tax credit? So I guess they're asking, can you make a donation to an ESD? And is that eligible for a tax deduction from the donor? Let's just start there.
Okay. Well, the bottom line is yes, you can. It's since we're a governmental entity, you can make donations to governmental entities and then deduct it off your return. You'd of course need to talk to your auditor or attorney to make sure you're doing that right. There are limitations now, not on what you can give, but how much credit you can actually get on your tax return for that. It's all kind of lumped together with your property taxes and everything else. I'm not an auditor and I'm not an accountant, but that's my understanding. You would need to do the letter back to the donor to make sure that they have the credit there and give them your tax ID number and that kind of information. So they can make a donation to you. They can make a donation to the VFD. Now, with that said, if your VFD is a 501c4 instead of a C3, it may or may not be deductible. Generally, it is thought to be, but I can't promise you that. I know 501c3s, 501c4s are a little different. But the point is, if somebody wants to make a donation for the benefit of the fire service, it should go to the ESD. Y'all are going to use that money or that property or whatever it is. And I've had people donate land to ESDs in the past and then deduct it off their taxes. I've also had them donate stock and a lot of other different things too. You just kind of got to be careful with what you get, because sometimes you don't want to look a gift horse too far in the mouth, but at the same time, you probably do want to make sure that this is really something that's right for you to do. And really, and I know a lot of y'all have heard this story before, make sure that you know what you're getting, because I've had people donate polluted properties to VFDs and stuff just because they know they can't sell it, and so they're happy to get it, get the deduction and get it off their books, and they're out of the chain of title, generally speaking. So you got to be very careful with what you accept as donations and make sure you do phase 1 or phase 2 or whatever different type of analysis you want to do of the property to make sure you don't have something that's going to end up biting you in the backside at some point.
Right. Okay. So, and I think that's pretty good there. The reason I think the question is being asked, because they asked the follow-up, what benefit would a 501c3 provide for fundraising that cannot be accomplished through the ESD? Meaning, should we get our fire department? Ken, as you said, you want the ESD to maintain ownership of those assets, anything that's being donated that's going to be of use to the provision of emergency services in that district. So you want to make sure that donation is to the ESD. As you kind of said, Ken, and this is a fact-specific question that we can't really answer, in terms of the donor's ability to write that off as a tax deduction, that's going to be a question for them and their tax person, right?
Correct. I will say this, one thing that's interesting, and yes, the VFD can go out and do fundraising, but you need to make sure that you know how much they're raising and what they're using it for. They're not buying a hot tub or something like that, that it's something that's legitimately going to the purpose. And I'm all for them doing fundraising. Again, the donor gets the same benefit no matter who they give it to. Now, one thing you got to keep in mind, and this is a little arcane, but I've had some entities do, for example, gun raffles. And you've got to do that through the 501c3 volunteer fire department, because that's the only exception under the law. Otherwise, you could look at both state and federal firearms charges against you when you go raffle off a rifle, for example. So be aware of that. There are arcane points in that.
Say that one more time, just so people heard that about the gun raffles.
Yeah, gun raffles are allowed under state law and federal law if you go through a volunteer fire department, some other kinds of charities, but not necessarily the governmental entities. So keep that in mind if you're going to be doing a gun raffle. And there may be other arcane points of law, but if you're going to be doing a gun raffle or something like that, that probably should run through the VFD.
I just want to make sure, because I've seen a lot of gun raffles in my time. And if you're going to start running afoul of firearms laws, you may want to make sure you're doing that through a nonprofit. By the way, I've been told that the audio is fine. Individual who emailed us that there was no audio, I've got from multiple sources that we are being heard. So that may be an individual problem. Let's go on to the second question. Okay, what is the required criteria for Board of Commissioner members, that's ESD board members, to receive remuneration? Some district members volunteer their time, while other ESD board members receive salary. Are there criteria, complications, or difficulties when board members receive pay? Well,
there's not. we don't receive any pay, and I'm not interested in that. I understand what volunteer means. But with that said, some do, and you have to have a policy in place. You have to follow the law, which is specifically going to be, and I'm looking for it now, so bear with me while I pull this up. But the statute on that is 775-038, and basically we get paid for days we actually work as a commissioner. It's based on what the water code says for municipal utility districts and different kinds of entities there. So we're entitled to receive, and I believe it's now up to $7,200 a year. Now, if you think about that times 5, you're looking at about $35,000 to $40,000 off the top. And that's fine if you got a lot of money, but if you don't, then I think some people might be a little upset with you for taking money off the top that's not going to boots and water.
And you don't have to receive compensation.
You do not.
Your services.
But you do need a policy. You do need to adopt a policy and follow what the law says. And I've got sample policies. I'm sure most of the attorneys do for those of our clients who have gone and done the compensation.
Yeah, I'm looking at it here too. It's section 775.038, like you cited. But all that does is refer you back to section 49, chapter 49 of the Water Code, which again is for MUD directors. So it's an interesting policy craft there that they've created, is just pointing you to what MUD directors get. $150 a day. Not to exceed $7,200 annually, like Ken said. So, but again, to directly answer the question, I don't think you can choose not to do it. There are some practical concerns in terms of what you can, how it looks from a public standpoint. But that's a decision you've got to make as your ESD board. Like Ken said, remember to have a policy instituted. So this is how we're going to handle that if your ESD board members do want to receive compensation. And
you do have to file paperwork and show that you actually work, and it's under oath and those kinds of things. There's like I said, I do have sample policies on that and items to adopt for forms and things like that to receive the compensation.
Yeah. And again, we're not here to do anyone's taxes, but I assume that's taxable income to the commissioner if they receive pay.
It is, and so you'll need to talk to your accountant or your auditor for the ESD and make sure that you're doing it right, because it's probably not a 1099, it's going to be a W-2, and so withholding has to be taken out and all that stuff too, but that's something the auditor will need to handle.
Well, that's something I didn't even think about. I was thinking more from the recipient's point of view, but you're right. As the payor, you're going to have to issue if you're going over, I know it's like $600 for most things. You may have to, as the employer, report those payments to the IRS. So that's something you're going to want to get with a CPA on, preferably one with governmental experience who knows how those kind of things work. Okay, I think we kind of tackled that one. Okay, so now we've got a workers' comp question. And again, workers' comp is a very thorny issue, but we're going to try to, and this is a long, long question. So let me see if I can distill it. I went over it just a second ago before. So basically, they're citing Chapter 607 of the Texas Government Code, which is the workers' compensation statute. And they say that the presumption applies to a firefighter or EMT who received a physical that failed to reveal evidence of the illness or disease, has been employed for 5 or more years as a firefighter or EMT, and the disease or illness was discovered during the employment as a firefighter or EMT. And the situation, and again, we don't want to get too situation specific on trying to answer your specific fact questions, but I think it's important here. Basically, they're throwing out the situation of a firefighter with only a year's experience on this job has a heart issue that wasn't discovered beforehand. Workers' comp is denying the claim because they're basically saying, this is a pre-existing condition that they had before they were employed by this entity, the district. So
I'll amplify on that just a little bit because, again, most of this part applies to a public safety employee, not necessarily a volunteer. There are other statutes that cover volunteers for these kinds of things. You should be providing workers' comp for your volunteers to make sure that their medical is at least covered if they get injured on the job. I'm not trying to put a plug in, but a big chunk of my partner's business, some of my partner's business is workers' comp, and they specialize in this area. So we could probably assist you with that if you have specific questions. But again, this is for an employee per se. There are other statutes that cover the volunteers, so you just need to be aware of that as well.
That's a good thing to be aware of. Yeah, that this is really going towards employees of the district, and the sort of global question that I think is applicable across the board to ESDs that are at least hiring employees. How does a district deny the hire due to physical exam findings? The idea is, so if we had done a physical on this person and found that they had this issue, could we have denied their hiring, or would that have been a discrimination based on a physical disability?
It probably wouldn't. And there is a practical way that you have to do this, especially for employees. You make what's called a conditional job offer prior to making them go get the actual physical. And then if they don't pass the physical, they can't do the lifting or something, then you would not hire them. So there is the potential that you could have somebody make a claim against you under civil rights acts and stuff. But that's the process, is you've got to do a pre-offer. You've got to make an offer of employment subject to the outcome of the physical examination. And again, volunteers are defined in this statute in 607 as well, but that's what you need to follow, because you do want to establish a baseline for the benefit of that person. So if they do end up with a job-related disease, then they may be eligible for workers' comp. Right now, and there's no law on this, there's no, they're probably going to address it, but with COVID, it's very important to understand. I've had clients who have had employees come down with COVID or volunteers, and then the workers' comp carrier denies it because that's still considered sort of a normal disease of life, like catching a cold or the flu or something like that. So they're not the same. So that's something else to think about.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely, I hadn't heard about some of that. Okay. I mean, I think the general, for the purposes of this question and trying to limit it down to something that can be answerable, you can deny hiring based on a claim of physical issues, but it's got to be job offer subject to
passing the physical.
Subject to passing the physical. And then, if that can be a workaround, but and this question had some other editorializing about how it might be unfair to firefighters, and that is tough. Hopefully you can work with your workers' compensation carrier to try to get an exception or something like that. But we need to go on. So let's go on to the next question. Okay, this is a fairly straightforward one. How are ESDs supposed to hire professional services, CPAs for auditing, or lawyers? How does a ESD go about doing that?
Well, as far as ESDs go, we all have to follow the Texas Professional Services Procurement Act, which dictates for political subdivisions for things like engineers, landscape architects, various things that you have to go through a process. And this is very important to understand. You have to go through a process whereby you don't talk about price at all. You go out for what's called a request for qualifications. You send out for requests for qualifications, the architect, the engineer, whatever's under the statute, and attorneys are not, for the state they are, but not for other political subdivisions. So you don't have to do this, but you could do a request for qualifications. Don't talk about price at all. Then you enter negotiations with the most qualified respondent. And then you do the negotiations. If you cannot reach an agreement, then you have to formally end those negotiations and then go to the next most qualified, to where you end up with the least qualified for the cheapest price, theoretically. Now, I want to point out, and I am editorializing here a little bit because I've had to defend architects over the years who have violated this law, is that you don't want to be involved in that. There was a school district in South Texas that was hiring an architect for a school project, and they started talking about in the initial meeting in front of the school board in a public meeting about how they could save the district money and rebate money back to them. Well, it was the other architects in the room who then turned those guys in, and they lost their licenses. So this was done by the architects and the engineers and some of these other professional services people to make sure that you get theoretically the most qualified person, but also so you don't talk about price until after you've already looked at them and ranked them on qualifications.
Okay. And I think that's probably a question more towards, there is no bidding, right? I mean, that's one of the
you can certainly, for those that are not, there is no bidding until the second step, but there's never any bidding per se, because you're not talking about price, you're talking about qualifications, and then you go in and discuss with the most qualified what the price is going to be and reach negotiations there. Now, with attorneys and CPAs, and it's again in the statute, so if you have any questions, we can always refer to the statute. It's in the government code. I believe I can't remember what chapter it is right now. It's in the 2000s. But in any event, you want to make sure and follow those procedures so that you don't end up with the school district had a black eye and got a lot of Public Information Act requests for various things, but it was really the architects themselves who ended up having to shoulder that burden, if you will.
Okay, let's move on from that one. Can ESDs charge for services like responding to gas leaks or motor vehicle accidents?
Absolutely. Now, you need to have a policy in place for that. There's a number of billing companies that are out there, and I've lately been dealing with a lot of them who also have a suggested ordinance that you pass that puts out your rates and fees. If you look at 775 041 and 040, which I'm trying to get to now, bear with me, is if you look at that, it says that a district or a person authorized by contract on the district's behalf, so that could be your service provider, may charge a reasonable fee for emergency services performed for or on behalf of a person or entity, including a fee for responding to a false alarm or a fire code inspection. You also would have your fees if you've adopted a fire code for plan reviews and all that kind of stuff and inspections. Now, it says a fee imposed by the district under 775-040 must be paid within a reasonable amount of time as established by the district. If it hasn't been paid, then we can go to court and file a complaint and, sue them to collect the money. I've only had to do that a couple of times, and it's on much larger bills for gas line breaks or something dramatic like that. So, and if you prevail, which you should, because it's not an issue of who did wrong. I often hear that, especially with broken gas lines. Well, it wasn't me, it was my subcontractor, or it was some other third party. Well, I'm sorry, you're the general contractor, so you're who we're looking to. If you want to back charge them, feel free to do so. But the issue is the fee reasonable? And that's very important to understand, is that we don't care about whose fault it was necessarily. We're just sending out a bill. And one of the ironies of EMS, for example, is that the shooter does not get billed for the shootee's ambulance ride. The shootee is the one who pays for all that. So, and that doesn't seem fair, but we don't have to determine negligence or whose fault it is or anything. We send a bill. The issue in court, if there's going to be one, is going to be, is the fee reasonable? And what I've done in the past is I have had my clients adopt the Texas Forest Service schedules and the FEMA schedules of what they would pay you to use one of your engines or your brush trucks. And it's all set out in there. I mean, $5 for a shovel, it's all in there. But that would, in my mind, establish that the fee is reasonable, because that's what the federal government or the state government would pay for that. Now, I've also seen billing companies that just say, you tell us what you want to charge. Well, you may have an issue at that point with whether your fee is reasonable or not, especially if you're talking about volunteers, so you're not out any money there, but you do have the engine. My district, we only charge for going to a controlled burn that you haven't called in as required by the law. And we probably won't bill you the first time because there are new people in the neighborhood and stuff. And if I haven't seen you before, we're just going to say, hey, by the way, you need to call in so we don't go running code 3 for a fire and endanger people's lives. So that's the only thing we bill for in my district. I know of other districts that bill for everything, EMS calls, whatever, and you can make some money on that. I would not think that it's a profit center. I've never seen it be something that derives a lot of money, but at least you can offset some of your costs there. And it's easier when you have paid staff where you know exactly what you're paying per hour. So you really need to think about this before you start adopting fees and start charging fees, is that you need to make sure, one, is it reasonable, and how do you determine reasonability? I've had some of my clients in some counties, all of them get together and they sit down and they look at these FEMA schedules and they look at the Homeland Security schedules and the Texas Forest Service schedules. And then they go and they determine what's reasonable based on the actual cost of what it's cost to operate that engine, for example. And then it seems reasonable because everybody in the county has adopted the same thing.
Well, let me ask this question as a follow-up there. If you said you may not bill them on the first controlled burn that you unauthorized or unreported controlled burn that you go out to. So if an ESD adopts this fee schedule, which that's what we're saying, you need to adopt a fee, a schedule of reasonable fees. If they adopt that, does that mean they have to bill for every single time they go out? Because I know some ESDs might not want to bill just the person in the neighborhood who they're responding to, but if a major corporation causes a huge gas leak or something, that may be different. I'm just spitballing there. Do you have to? Well, you have that schedule. Do you have to bill?
My rule of thumb is if you have a charge, you can't be discriminatory on who you charge, because it's Ken or whatever. So you really need to bill. Now you can put in your policy that it's discretionary on the first or the second offense, for example. Okay, now a prosecutor, and this is a little bit different, always has discretion as to whether or not to file charges. This is not exactly, a criminal issue here, but there could be discretion and you put it in there. I mean, I've had clients that only bill people who have driver's licenses that show a residence that's not in the district. I think that's very discriminatory, and I think that could lead to trouble. Okay. I think if you're going to bill somebody, you're going to bill everybody, and you're going to try and collect on everybody. And at some point, you don't want to spend $3,000 on an attorney to collect a $500 bill. So you need to have all that in your policies as to what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're doing it, and then that it's reasonable.
I think that's a good segue to our next question. Kind of along the same lines, can ESDs charge for excess/non-emergency calls? As an example of this, excess and non-emergency situation, we received 19 calls to a single residence last year. January 2nd, received 3 calls within the space of 2 hours or so. Do you know of any ESDs that can charge for this kind of types of services?
Again, yes, you can. Again, you have to have policies and procedures in place, but it specifically says answering a false alarm. Okay, so you can charge for those. There are other statutes that may allow you to do other things in relation to that. Again, we don't charge for false alarms. We go code 1 to them anyway, because very rarely do they turn out to be a fire. It's usually a malfunction 99.9% of the time of the system. But if we did get a lot of calls to one residence, and I don't know if this was a medical call or if this was a fire alarm activation call that created this situation, but we also have medics that intervene with people who are calling 911 unnecessarily and calling them a lot. So yes, you could bill for all of that. You just need to set it out in your policy. But again, you need to figure out how you're going to do that to where it's fair for everybody, but also what you do with that frequent flyer or the problem person who just won't fix their fire alarm.
Well, and you probably need a pretty clear definition of what excess or non-emergency call is, right?
Yes. I mean, if it's a cat in a tree all the time, then we probably need to think about doing something else. But, if it's because a person is very sick or has a disease that requires them, to call 911 a lot, well, that's what we do, in my opinion. That's what we do. So when it becomes excessive, I don't know. And, certainly a false alarm is easy when you have more than 2 or 3 to say that that's excessive. person may be calling 911 to go to the hospital because they need to, and they may need to do it a lot. I don't know, but there's other avenues you can take besides just charging the person, trying to get them to some definitive care, trying to make sure that they're taken care of. We have a number of districts that are doing sort of this mobile integrated health or paramedic intervention to try and alleviate the problem of what are called frequent flyers. That sounds kind of pejorative, but we do have that ability to do that.
Well, I think it kind of, I think so. The general summation of all this is, yes, you can charge fees for services, but you need to have your ducks in a row before you do it with a policy that imagines whatever situations you think you're going to want, and also a reasonability, which is sort of an objective standard, right? That you can point to and say, these are reasonable fees. I think that's
right.
Good for those two questions. All right. Going back to an email question. Can an ESD legally pay for VFD firefighter physicals and also their spouses? Henderson County coming with that question.
Well, I would say certainly the firefighters themselves. Now, the spouses, and the number one rule you've got to remember is we as governmental entities cannot give anything away no matter how good the purpose. So we really can't make donations and things like that. Certainly getting physicals for our firefighters, our volunteers, and establishing baselines and doing whatever we need to do, that would certainly be true. Allowing physicals for spouses or family members, no, not necessarily. I mean, if you're providing medical insurance, though, and they pay the premium, then for that additional family member or whomever, then that's certainly acceptable. But you can't just unilaterally do it. You're going to, again, have to have a policy and a budget item and how we're going to do the physicals, when we're going to do the physicals, and why we're doing the physicals.
Right. So kind of following up on the earlier question about ESD receiving donations, the flip side of that is you can't make donations as an ESD.
Correct.
Right? You can't just give away taxpayer money and things and benefits. So that kind of, like you said, you'd have to have some sort of policy that explains why you're doing that. That makes sense.
Well, and I'll give you an example. You have a volunteer who passes away, or an old member of the department or one of their spouses. Well, the first thing you want to do is send flowers. Well, that's probably for the VFD to do. That's not for us because we're giving something away there, if you see what I'm saying. So even if you had a budget item for that kind of stuff, and you can certainly do, volunteer appreciation dinners and things like that. You just have to budget for it, have a policy for it. But just, flowers or donating to the PTA or something like that, we as governmental entities should not be doing that. Okay,
moving on. Our ESD is very small with a yearly budget in the low 40s. I'm assuming that's $40,000. We do not own any assets and subcontract all services to the local VFD. That's fairly common. We basically reimburse the VFD for approved expenses. All donations are given directly to the VFD and all fundraising is done by the VFD. Is there any reason to change this? This has been from the inception of the ESD. They're donating through everything through the VFD and all the fundraising is done by the VFD. This is kind of rehashing our first question. Right? What are the reasons that we want to make sure that donations are given to the ESD or at least put in the ESD's name, Ken?
Well, number one, again, if we're paying for it, we should own it. And the statute very clearly says, Chapter 775, if you use district funds, whether it runs through the VFD's account or somebody else's account, it belongs to you, at least to the money you put into it. So if you're going to be buying a brush truck, you're not giving them money to go buy a brush truck. That's your brush truck, should be titled in your name. You should go get the note on it. You let them use it under the contract. So again, you don't want to just give stuff away, and you can't. It says very clearly in the law that if district funds are used, we own it. So that leads to problems like, for example, of refurbishing a fire station, putting a new roof on a fire station. You can't take that roof off. You can't give it away. So you've got to have some sort of agreement as to how that's going to work. And the easiest thing to tell my clients is they want a new roof on that thing. As soon as they deed it to us, we'll take over all of it. We'll put the new roof on. We'll maintain it for them. They'll have a place to go just like they always have. Now can get into some psychological issues. But going back and say the question again, because there's something else I wanted to bring up about that.
Well, I think what this question is more anticipating is the idea that the VFD as an independent entity, a 501c3 entity, can collect its own donations and do its own fundraising, which is true. But as you said, you want to know what's going on there, because if you're working in partnership with them, you need to know what exactly they're collecting that money and what they're doing with it, right?
And you need a good contract that says, where do these assets go? Because again, if there's a split between the ESD and the VFD, you don't want to have to go rebuy fire stations on $40,000 a year. You can't do it. You don't want to have to go rebuy fire trucks. So you need to make sure that if the VFD goes away for whatever reason, that the assets stay, because the VFD, and I've said this 1,000 times, the VFD is never paid for anything, ever. Yeah, it may have run through their account. It may have been on one of their checks, but they got that from the county government, state government, federal government, ESD, or donations. And people are making donations not so Ken Campbell could turn his fire station when he gets upset with the ESD into a Jiffy Lube. They are making donations because they want somebody to come put out their fire or respond to their medical calls. So you need to make sure as an ESD that your contract very clearly states exactly what happens if the contract's ever terminated, if they're fired, if they dissolve, whatever, to ensure that those assets that have been paid for over the years by everybody in this area stay with the entity. Because remember, a volunteer fire department in an ESD is only a volunteer fire department because the ESD says it is through that contract. Otherwise, they have no authority to go run any calls. We determine that, not the county, not a city that's in our district, us, the ESD. So again, you need to make very sure that you work with your attorney to make sure that your contract is there to protect the taxpayers and to protect the assets that are there, because you don't want to have to remake the wheel.
Okay, so to kind of put a button on that question, I don't think what I'm hearing is there's no reason to change and try to prevent the VFD from getting donations or fundraising, but you need transparency and an understanding of where that money's going, just as you are supposed to be transparent in your governmental duties as you're spending taxpayer money. You want to understand where that money from the public is going to make sure that it's going to stay in your district.
Well, and again, they have to, under the law of the Nonprofit Corporations Act, the Business Organizations Code now, they have to maintain books and finances, and anybody can see those books. And they're also generally subject to the Open Records Public Information Act. There are some conflicting opinions out there about whether all of them are or are not, but they certainly are up to the amount of money they get from you. So you need to know if they're raising $1 million, then you need to know that, because we want to make sure it's being spent wisely. And more to the point, if they're making $1 million and they want $1 million more from you, what's it going for? So that's kind of important, that you make sure through the entire process that everybody agrees. And yes, you can sit down and talk with your service provider, your contracted service providers, and decide on that. And I'll give you an example to go back to one of the previous questions about billing. My contract even says in there that they're free to go raise money, but they got to tell us exactly what they raised. Their accounts are open to us, what they're going to buy with it, because I don't want to buy safety vests twice. I don't want to buy brush trucks twice. And we want to make sure that money is actually going to something instead of just sort of sitting there. And again, the whole point of the fundraising is to enhance the services, I would hope. And that goes back to the billing. My contract also says, yeah, you can bill, but all that money is accounted for at the end of the year, and it belongs to the district, and we will reallocate that money to needs that you have through the budget process. Because again, if you think about it, most of these VFDs today are running with your trucks, your gas, your hose, everything. So they're only, quote, making money off the billing because they don't have to have the overhead of actually having a business. So, it's really easy to be a car dealer if you steal all your cars. And I'm not trying to equate them to car thieves, but if you have no overhead, where's that money go? What's the point of recouping that money? And who ultimately is paying that money? Well, it's the taxpayer. So you need to have discussions with your contractors as to where fundraiser money goes, what it's used for, all that kind of stuff. In my contract, I go so far as to say you cannot accept anything without telling us first, because I want to know if you're going to get a polluted property or, some albatross around our neck that we're going to have to deal with. Plus, we're going to have to put fuel in it or insure it or something else, so we need to be able to budget ahead of time. We're not going to say no if somebody wants to give us cash or a truck or whatever, but let's make sure that we have a need for it and a use for it and what the plan is. And more to the point, who's going to own it? Who's going to insure it? Who's going to repair it?
Excellent. Okay, so question about the treasurer's bond. What's the amount for? We get this question at Safety all the time. What is the amount for an ESD's treasurer's bond?
There is no amount. I have historically recommended that you have, and here's the thing, is you got to have a bond, and let me pull up that statute real quick. Bear with me. I'm trying to think of where it is now.
Hold on.
But the treasurer has to have a bond, and it is set by the commissioner's court. Okay? Here in Travis County, we did not even know what that number was. And more to the point, all of us had dishonesty insurance, which is not a bond. Okay? The law says you have to have a bond. So if you're the treasurer, I've always recommended that whatever your budget is, you better have a bond in that amount. The problem with that is that if you get to go buy a bond in excess of $100,000, at least with some of the vendors out there, then that treasurer has to do a full personal financial statement and disclosure, which a lot of people don't want to do. We agreed in Travis County we would do $100,000. The problem is that $100,000 is not going to cover you if they go steal more than $100,000. That bond is not, and the employee dishonesty policy would have covered that, assuming that you got a limit in there that was a reasonable amount. I've had people steal $100,000 of ESD money, and we only had a $50,000 insurance policy. Well, that's bad. Okay, so you need to make sure when you talk to your insurance company that you get employee dishonesty for everybody else, but the treasurer has to have a bond, and that's something we probably need to think about in the law, that it has to have a bond, and after you get above 100,000, it's hard to get out there and get that because people don't want to have to disclose all their personal financial facts and things about themselves and criminal records and all those things. So we do 100,000 here in Travis County. The problem is if they steal more than 100,000, we're in trouble after that.
Which is why you would have insurance, or at least try to get insurance.
Well, the problem is insurance is not going to cover you if you're bonded.
Really?
It's either the bond or insurance. And most of us had, 250, 300, 500,000 dishonesty policies. Well, that would more than cover what would be stolen, and now we're back down to 100,000.
And so your recommendation is 1 year of operating, right? But for some ESDs that gets to be a pretty intensive bonding process. So
it does.
Just to recap, 775037 says the county judge sets the amount of your bond. We've had county judges call us and recommend, and we usually say, a year of operating, because if the treasurer makes off with all the money, you want to be okay for a year until the next amount of revenues come in. But as Ken has said, higher level bonds lead to some issues with having to get that bond done, that the treasurer has to go through some hoops. So that is one of the big issues that we always get asked about. Let's move on for the sake of time. Okay. Discuss record keeping requirements for equipment purchases from tax revenues versus equipment purchased with donations. So are there different record keeping requirements for if you just purchase it with tax money versus what somebody purchases with a donation?
No, there's really not. And all ESDs, just like any governmental entity, have to follow the Texas Records Retention Acts that require you to keep everything. It tells you when you can throw away a Post-it note. It tells you when you can throw away a patient care report. There's some things like, it's kind of weird, but you can throw away your minutes. I think it was your minutes after like 10 years. I don't know why you'd ever throw away your minutes. Okay. Because if you need to go back and find out why you did what you did, you need that information. But you have to maintain them according to Texas Records Retention Act. They, through the Texas State Library and Archives Commission, have established what are called schedules for governmental entities to use. And you would use the public safety one, PS, and the Schedule GR, which is General Governmental Records. And you have to follow those. You can't throw anything away. You can't throw away a message slip where somebody left a message until, and it says, sometimes it says in there, until no longer administratively valuable. Okay, well, once the message has been returned, you can throw it away. But you have to follow those schedules. I also when we adopt our records retention schedules, because otherwise you have to make one yourself, which is impossible or very difficult anyway. Just adopt the GR and the PS so and you just look on them all the time and say, okay, can I throw this away? Can I not throw this away? I also make my contractors follow it, because that's where a lot of places where the rubber meets the road is actually, oh, there you go. You're sharing screen.
I'm showing the Texas State Library and Archives. It's tsl.texas.gov. And this, if you can't see the address, it's /SLRM/local retention. This is their local retention.
And I want to point out right there, right in the center of that thing, it says warning in all cap red letters. Unless these retention schedules have been adopted by your local government, the retention periods listed in these schedules may not be used for the destruction of your records. So everybody has to do this. And if you haven't, you need to do it pretty quick. They have sample ordinances and things for you to use to adopt. I've got them as well. Everybody needs to have these, and you need to make your contractors follow them as well.
School districts. There's a few down here that apply to different districts, but there's some for police and fire stuff.
Yeah, that's the PS that I was talking about. You'll see the PS there.
There you go.
And then there should be a GR as well.
GR, records comment to all local governments. Literally, they did it all for you already. So
it's done. You just need to adopt them, and you need to send it off to T-Slack and show them that you've done it.
Yeah, they're great folks there. Very helpful at the State Library and Archives Commission. They know everything there is to know about records retention and what you should keep and how long. So I highly recommend getting in touch with those folks. Let's go to the next question. We had one here about audits. Regarding auditors, should ESD change auditors periodically, like every 5 years? This would be to preclude the same folks looking at our books year after year. This is out of Kamal County.
I think you should. I think you should look into that to make sure that you've got a fresh set of eyes there. Do you have to? Not necessarily. I know of a lot of auditors who, on their own volition, after 2 or 3 or 5 years with a client, will say, you need to get another auditor now. And I've actually had them say that to my ESDs. You need to go find another auditor just to make sure that you're covered and that you get a fresh set of eyes on this.
One of the I've heard of ESDs actually setting that as a policy, saying after so many years, 2-3 years, however many, we have to change auditors. Now that can run you into some trouble in some areas of the state where they don't have a lot of CPAs with a lot of time, and so it may not be something you can do. It's not something you necessarily have to do, but it is definitely, I think, a best practice. Would you agree, Ken, that to try to get a different set of eyes on the books as often as you can?
Yes.
Okay. So can ESDs give credit cards or procurement cards to employees?
Yes, and volunteers. What you need to do is, make sure that they know you're a governmental entity, okay? Put a limit on it. Have a policy about use of credit cards, because people take advantage of it. I know that's hard to believe, but have a policy on it. And your counties probably have a policy. Yes, you can do that. You don't want to, and I've had clients do this before, where the credit card company does not understand what you're doing and that you're a governmental unit. So then they have that person who's applying be the guarantor on it. So all of a sudden the commissioner is a guarantor on a credit card for the ESD. And then somebody can steal money, and now you've got to pay for it. So again, you need to make sure that the vendor knows. I don't like debit cards, but that's just me. You want to have a limit on it. You want to have a policy about how to use it and when to use it and what to use it for. You need to have a purchase order or some sort of accounting system where they have to put in and show you the bill before they get reimbursed, and make sure that, taxes aren't being charged. If you're a governmental entity or a nonprofit, you got to do the Texas Controller of Public Accounts sales tax exemption form and tax exemption form. So there's a lot involved in it, but yes, you can do that.
Yeah, the big thing I've seen there is a spending limit of like $500 or something. So yeah, they can go run out and get pens or staples or something, but you don't have them buy with the ability to buy big ticket items. But I think again, policy to try to set out how that card is used and make sure everybody knows where the bill's going to go and who's on the hook for it is a good thing.
Exactly.
Okay. Let's see. Moving on here. Can an ESD exercise eminent domain?
No, we do not have the power of eminent domain, or what's commonly called condemnation. We have to go out on the market and buy what we have to buy at whatever the market rate is. Now, theoretically, condemnation, eminent domain is paying the person for the taking based on an appraisal and based on, a reasonable price for that. A lot of cities and counties do condemnation or make an offer in lieu of condemnation. We don't have that power, so we're kind of stuck with whatever we can get.
Okay. It's kind of a specific one. Our ESD is in a dispute with the city and in our district. A city council member approached one of our on-duty career rank and file firefighters at the grocery store, started hassling him about the ESD policy. Is there any legal way to prevent that from happening?
I don't think there's a legal way to prevent that from happening. People certainly have a right to talk about whatever they want to talk about. Our personnel don't necessarily have to listen to it, but you want to be polite. This is a city councilman in this particular case, and communication is very important. If you have a dispute with the city, well, you need to communicate and make sure that, everybody's on the same page. But you can't stop them, a city councilman, from going out and bad-mouthing the ESD, or conversely, us bad-mouthing them. But it's really poor form to go out there and do that, especially for the ESD. We don't want to make enemies of county commissioners and school board trustees and city council people at all. So I think the practical, and this is the counselor part of my license, the practical thing is go talk to that councilman and find out what's bothering them and why, and then see what you can do to resolve it.
Okay. Our ESD collects a penny sales tax. If voters approve an overlay district in May, does it automatically get a penny sales tax too? I can answer that one. No.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's it. That's the short answer right there. It's a separate political subdivision. It has to have its own election. And if there's no sales tax available, then they're just out of luck. And I've had that happen before. But no, it does not automatically come along with a sales tax. You have to adopt it through an election process. So they would not have that. If there's that other penny is available, they could then do an election. And we've done it in the past in some of my counties with some of my ESDs that have overlays. Okay, you guys go get a penny. We're going to go get a penny. Let's go together. We have to have separate elections, but, we'll do it all at the same time. So that's something to keep in mind, is that it's not going to come with it.
Yeah. And I think the big thing that you said there is remember, there's only 2% of sales tax that's available to local governments. 6.25% goes straight to the state. So that 2% that's reserved for local governments, if that 2% is already used up before your overlay gets created, the overlay doesn't have the ability to get any sales tax. So
that's correct.
Yeah, there's no transference. An overlay district is a separate political subdivision, separate entity. Okay, moving on. Last call for questions. If anybody has been waiting, I don't know if Cliff, you can put up the ways to get in touch with us again. safety@texas.net. Texas is spelled out. 512-567-0857 is the text line, and you can also call us at 512-251-8101. Last call for questions before we get out of here. Last couple questions that we have. Can an ESD grant over 65 and homestead exemptions to property taxpayers in the district? I know the answer to that one too, but if you want to take it.
It's local option. There are some that are mandatory. School districts, for example, have to give a general residence homestead exemption. Other political subdivisions like cities, county, school districts, or special districts do not. Once you give it, though, there's no mechanism for ungiving it. Okay, so that's very important to understand. And same thing with over 65. There are some that are mandatory. Age 65 or older or disabled for school districts, that's mandatory. For us, it's optional. Once you do it, though, you can change the amount that you give, but it can never go below $3,000 for over 65. My personal opinion is, again, and my district does it this way, and we always have, is we don't give any exemptions that we don't have to. It's because it all burns the same and the people get sick the same. So, and they might actually use the resources more depending on age and infirmities and all those kinds of things. So we've never given those. I have a couple that, want a couple of my clients who've been wanting to sort of give the idea of tax relief back to the citizens by granting a homestead exemption or a over 65 exemption. But again, once you do it, there's no mechanism for it to go away.
Right. And the comptroller has good resources on tax. They have an entire booklet on property tax exemptions. Again, you can do it. You don't have to do it for homestead and over 65. Let's see here. Okay. Can ESD use funds to pay a private ambulance service to contract with the district? Another pretty straightforward one.
The answer is yes. You've got to have a contract with adequate controls to ensure the public good. And you could contract with one of the private vendors out there, the for-profit vendors. They're obviously nonprofits. A lot of us do it more with nonprofits because that's our service provider. But you can do that, and I would definitely go out for bid on something like that and see what you get, because if you're already providing, say, for example, your EMS transport service, once you get rid of it, once you sell the assets and lose the people, it's real hard to rebuild it. The best way to do it, in my opinion, and this is for counties and cities and ESDs, is for you to do it yourself as part of the governmental entity, and you to do it yourself. Yeah, you can argue whether or not you could get it cheaper somewhere else, but I have, and I'm not going to say anybody's out there that does it now, but I have had people come in and say, we'll do it for free, and we'll give you 2 MICU capable units, and we'll do it for free, and then a couple of years later, they come back and say, oh, so sorry. We just can't do this for free anymore. We can't make it off the building. So it's $1 million or we're gone. And by the way, even if we stayed, you're now going to have one ambulance. So keep that in mind, is once you go out to contract, if you're already providing it yourself, you could end up, again, getting upside down.
But the answer is yes. And the thing that a lot of people get confused on is even if they're a for-profit private ambulance company, you can do that. Okay. Let's see. Should ESD board members be covered by liability insurance?
Absolutely. And they should be. VFIS is very good about that. There are other insurers out there, but you should have liability insurance, because you could be driving in your car doing ESD business and have a wreck and get sued. And your insurance company says, well, you were doing ESD business. That's not our problem. So you need to make sure that you need to look at your policies at least once a year and make sure that you've got, you have a truck now that you've bought, you forgot to put it on, and it's actually under your name, but it's under the VFD's insurance. Well, you need to have it under your insurance. And yes, you need to have liability insurance, because there's all kinds of things you can get sued for. Generally speaking, and I hate to throw out a vendor, but VFIS has all that pretty much covered, and I'm sure all the others that are out there do as well.
Yeah, Barbara will be appreciative of the plug there, so that's fine. They're good friends. Okay, question coming out of Nueces County, and then I have one last question after that, and then we're going to have to get out of here. How do you handle a nosy person who consistently files public information requests with your ESD? So this is sort of the classic person filing nuisance PIA requests, open records requests.
Well, very gingerly. I actually had a client that we had a person who, and they're famous, it's a group of them, famous for just inundating the local governmental entities with just tons and tons and tons of Public Information Act requests. Number one, you always want to be polite and respectful and make sure you're getting them what you're supposed to be getting them. You want to charge for it if you have paid staff that you have the ability to charge for it. It's limited by law. You can't just make it up. It's 10 cents a page. You can charge a certain percentage of overhead, computer time, things like that if it's more than 50 copies, different things like that. But you want to make sure when you get a Public Information Act, the Act request is that, one, you go first determine, because once you start working on it, you can't charge for it. You go determine what it's going to require and send out a cost estimate, even if it's 10 cents, because most people just want you to send them the document. And that's pretty easy to do when it's a PDF in your computers. But when it's in a booklet that you have to pull out and then copy it, you may be better off to say, hey, there's a cheaper way to do this. Come in here and look at it. But we literally spent, I know the county ended up hiring one person just to handle the Public Information Act requests. But I've had historically people who, I won't say abuse the system, but certainly take advantage and become harassing with it. You can also, by policy, and some of my clients have done this, you can limit the amount of hours that you have to allow them. And I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but we did that in one of my clients. And when they reached the number of hours for the request, they had to start paying for everything. And so that ended that problem pretty quickly.
Okay. I think that's a good answer to that question. Let's answer one more and then get out of here. Because it's an SB2 related question, and I think it's just a matter of clarifying something. Our ESD is considered a small taxing unit. Are we subject to 3.5% or 8.5% relative to rollback? And remember, it's not rollback, it's the voter approval rate. So they say they're a small taxing unit. That's not really for use in determining voter approval. Right.
It's not used in your calculation. It's just a simplified process. And in fact, that's what the statute provision is called. It's section 26.052 of the Texas Tax Code. And it says simplified tax rate notice for taxing units with a low tax levy. And so that would be what we've talked about before, that you have a tax rate that's less than 50 cents and you bring in less than $500,000 in that year. That's a small taxing unit. And actually, they're called taxing units with low tax levies. Not to be confused with special taxing units, which is defined up in the first section. And that's where the 1.08 and the 1.35 come in. And that's in your calculations. But what a special taxing unit says is a taxing unit other than a school district for which the maintenance and operations tax rate proposed for the current tax year is 2.5 cents or less per $100 of taxable value, or a junior college district or a hospital district. They get to go to the 108. They still have the VAR and all that stuff. We're all stuck pretty much at 3.5%. Now, I don't want to go too far into SB2, but that's where your de minimis rate and your calculations come in, and you want to make sure that you follow the procedures. Because if you're going to rely on your de minimis rate, then you're going to have to, and even if you're a small taxing unit, you may have to, because the calculations are the calculations. The voter approval rate is the voter approval rate. The no new revenue rate is the no new revenue rate. So you have to follow that, but you also, if you're going to adopt, and this is the way I believe most people interpret this, is if you're going to adopt above your voter approval rate or your effective rate and rely on that de minimis rate, you've got to do it 71 days before the election day. So they can petition you because then it becomes another little calculation, you may get the benefit of the 108% at that point instead of the 1.35.
Right. So let me just distill here. Small taxing unit is not really a thing. It's the low taxing levies. And that is the under $500,000, which most of you or a lot of you are familiar with. That's just to do with your tax simplified notice requirements. The voter approval rates, the 3.5 and the 8%, that's special taxing units. You're not a hospital district. You're not a junior college district. Some of you may have tax rates lower than 2.5 cents. That would make you a special taxing unit, which would make you eligible for the 8%. So that kind of goes to that question. The questioner asked, small taxing unit, which percentage, 3.5 or 8% do I use? Those two things are incongruous. They don't actually relate to one another. So with that, we need to kind of wrap up and get you folks out of here. Let's see. So first thing I want to do is let's take a look at this message from our sponsor, Infinity Services, who we're very thankful to for sponsoring this webcast.
As the top website providers for special purpose districts in Texas, we take great pride in providing outstanding customer service at an affordable price. We offer a wide range of services, including website design, development and maintenance, email and text message alerts, video and teleconferencing services, social media marketing, election education programs, communication consulting, and much more. Together, we can keep your residents informed about your district. Contact us today and see what we can do for you.